Well, welcome back to the channel again. It's still Wednesday, so figured since I just read the one book, we might as well get some civil aircraft in. You guys like that book, so let me get it going here. We left off U.S. dominance, 1945 to 1953. So we'll get going and see where we go. World War II had a profound effect on the United States Airlines. They emerged stronger, fitter, and readier to create a global route network, using experience gains on military contracts and a new class of long-range, high-performance aircraft. In the United States, as many other countries, the wartime needs of the military consumed much of the country's aircraft production, while commercial transport were also pressed into service as freighters and troop carriers. Generally, the airlines served the nation's most important routes, with the DC-3 at the same time satisfying the various booming needs of the military and other government organizations. Pan America had established a wide-range network during the interwar years. Its service extended from Latin America and across the Pacific, and just before war broke out in Europe, the airline had begun transatlantic service using a Boeing 314 flying boat. It was a natural candidate for long-range international government contracts, and this it undertook, although jointly with other carriers, venturing beyond North America for the first time. Ironically, the primary equipment used on these government contracts was a Douglas DC-4, directed by the airlines in its pre-war DC-4E form. It is now used by the airlines as the military C-54. The Douglas was joined by the Boeing Stratoliner, flown across the North Atlantic by TWA, and the Scoviga VS-44 flying boat, used to establish a New York, Ireland route by American Export Airlines on May 26, 1942. Airline crews also became involved in so-called hump operation, flown from 1942 to lift supplies across the Himalayas from India to China in support of the Chinese and United States forces units based in the country. Pan America was instrumental in setting up the operation throughout the provisions of DC-3s and experienced crews, the U.S. Air Force itself having little exposure to such difficulties transportation operations. The hump operation finished in 1945 with the fall of Japan, releasing extremely experimental civilian military crews into the airline system. Combined with the various transoceanic government contracts over the Atlantic and Pacific, it greatly broadened the possibility of the U.S. carriers. They were left in a strong position with a solid understanding of global routes and extensive hard-earned knowledge base among the crews. At the same time, the military had been funding the development of long-range four-engine transports, clearly represented by the C-54. These advanced aircraft also included the Lockheed C-69 and a machine better known as the Constellation. Okay, down below is the Lockheed C-69. Right here. My hand's not on it. Oop. Right there is the C-69 they just talked about. Some good information on it. Built in 1944. Constellation Rise. TWA had ordered 9 modeled 49 Constellations before the war, and Lockheed began building the prototype in 1940. The United States joined the war efforts after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That's what drew the United States into World War II. And in 1942, the Constellation prototype was requisitioned as the military XC-69 transport. By the time the aircraft was ready for its maiden flight on January 9, 1943, TWA had upped its order to 40, a figure matched by Pan America, but neither carrier received a single aircraft since production for the military use only. In the event the aircraft proved technically challenging and although its performance was exceptional, only 15 examples were built during the war, and service trials could not begin in earnest until 1944. Most of the Constellation's problems were caused by its Wright R3350 radial engine. But even as the Wright was working to fix these, Lockheed was devising new variants for the Air Force. In the event the end of the war brought a mass cancellation of the orders, most of the C-69s were sold to civilian operators, and the aircraft in an advanced state of build on the production line were completed as civilians L-049 airliners. The type was certification as such on December 11, 1945, and the Lockheed's brave decision to develop a model for commercial use gave it a huge lead in the emerging market of long-range passenger aircraft. So here is a picture of the Lockheed 049 Constellation right here on top. And then below that is a Lockheed 649 built in 1947. It's a newer model. They just kept developing. Unlike current, when kind of stagnated and haven't had huge developments in a while. And then this one is a Lockheed L-1049G Super Constellation built in 1955. Lockheed's rivals had also realized that the world's post-war airlines were going to demand a new breed of aircraft. While Douglas was developing the DC-6 from the C-54 and the DC-4, Boeing was working on the Model 377 Stratocruiser, but neither aircraft would be available for service for at least a year and a half. Even though there was plenty of surplus C-54s available for conversion, there was nothing on the market that could rival the L-049 combined with the speed and range. On November 1945, Lockheed took orders from Air France, American Overseas Airlines, the successor to American Export Airlines, Eastern Airlines, KLM, Pan Am, TWA for a total of 89 aircraft. Ultimately, the company sold 103 of the L-49s. The first of the new air-build aircraft emerged in 1947, but the first example modified C-69 airframe had been delivered to TWA in 1945. Pan Am took its first Constellation in January 1946, and TWA began its regular New York to Paris scheduled on February 5th. Journey time was typically 16 hours with technical stops for fuel at Greater and Shannon. 16 hours! Oh, right now I think it's 8-hour flight. Here's a bunch of information on the Constellations, how many were built and such. Hopefully you can read that good. I can't tell. Development work on the R3350 engine, which increased power and reliability, allowed Lockheed to re-engineer the L-49 into the L-69, the first truly commercial Constellation variant. First delivered to Eastern in 1947, the L-649 is the optional Speed Pack cargo panner, generally improved performance and more luxury accommodation. Providing the L-649 with more fuel capacity allowed Lockheed to market the L-749 with the possibility of making a non-stop flight from New York to Paris. Although a technical stop could still be forced by the inclement weather or other factors, the manufacturer also offered optional weather radar for the L-649 and the L-749 as a retrofit or factory option. So here is a DC-4 from 1948, and then a DC-6 from 1947. So Douglas trying to catch up with Lockheed. In September 1947, Douglas began flying its DC-6, which I just showed you. A freighter is for packages only. An aircraft where passengers drive the DC-6B had already been ordered by United and American. TWA merciless owner Howard Hughes had prevented the airline's major rivals from acquiring Constellations, leaving the way clear for Douglas. Now Lockheed had to recognize the company as a major rival, since DC-6B carried 23 more passengers than the L-74-9 and offered comparable performance. In response, it inserted fuel plugs forward and aft in the Constellation wings, increasing its fuel length and capacity. Power was again increased as were more weights, and the new L-49 made its first flight in October 1950. By the time the L-1049 airline service by TWA on December 15, 1951, the first aircraft had been named the Super Constellation, but also faster than DC-6 had already been operating since April. The Douglas easily outsold the L-1049, even though Lockheed developed its aircraft through a range of variants. To make matters worse, the DC-7, now threatened, was a superior to the L-1049, that another major re-engineering effort was required. Lockheed toyed with the introduction of a Pratt & Whitney T-34 turboprop power plant to its ultimate Constellation, but ultimately settled to further improve the R-3350, slightly lower fuel fuselage and new wings. The result was the L-1649A Starliner, a machine so different that it was no longer called Constellation. Along the most advanced piston engine aircraft ever built, it was easily outsold by the DC-7 and brought Lockheed's immediate involvement in the airline market to an end. Here's a DC-7C built in 1956. The type of entered service with American in April 1947 and sold well. With the basic DC-6 in production, Douglas began improving the design. First, it produced a length DC-6A freighter and set off warning bells at Lockheed because it clearly had the potential to become a fine airliner. And so, in fact, when Douglas DC-6B became to market, it was superstitions struggled to compete with it. The Douglas may have lacked the good looks of Lockheed, but it was faster and superior reliability by the standards of the time. The L-1049 was a Constellation competitor to the DC-6B. Only a few examples were actually available to the airlines until Lockheed introduced the L-1049C. At least it was allowed to offer a turbo combined version of the R-3350 to commercial aircraft. The engine had been restricted to military use thus far. The new engine allowed the Super Constellation to match the DC-6 for performance and better its payload. Okay, so we have a Corvair CV340 from 1955 and a Boeing Strata Cruiser from 1954 that Pan America used. Boeing had produced two great airlines in the war in the years immediately before the war, the Clipper and the Stratoliner. Unfortunately, production of both had been curtailed by the outbreak of World War II. Boeing's wartime efforts had focused on combat aircrafts. Among them was the B-29 heavy bomber, just as it developed the Stratoliner from the B-17. The company had then set about developing a transport from the B-29. The U.S. Air Force ordered 3 prototypes of the resulting XC-97 Stratofortress on January 1943, with 4 YC-97 aircraft following. These were based on the more advanced B-50, and the 4th was finished for VIP flying and featured airline-style seats. By the time Boeing had already announced that it was world-building commercial version of the C-97 and built commercial version of the in 1947, Pan Am had ordered 20 of the new Strata Cruisers. The Strata Cruisers were introduced on Pan Am's transatlantic route along the Lockheed Airlines on June 1949. Although it carried more passengers than the Constellation, the Strata Cruiser has shorter range. Orders for the Strata Cruiser came in from Northwest United BOAC, but ultimately only 56 of them were built. Boeing's days had not yet come, but come it would with the era of the jetliner. Here's a breakdown of what were built and when and how much. Domestic service. On their domestic operations, the United States Airlines faced a dilemma that would persist into the 1970s. How best to replace the DC-3? The airlines needed to offer similar level of service domestically as they did internationally, and the DC-3 C-47 simply was not able to do the job. On the other hand, it was cheap to own and reliable, characteristics that made it difficult to replace. Ultimately, two manufacturers came forward and designed the Martin and with its unpressurized 202 and Corvair with its pressurized C-240. First flown in November 1946, the 202 entered service in November 1946. The Martin struggled to establish the aircraft in service. Technical difficulties and crashes caused more problems, and although Martin produced a much more capable version of the 404, only 149 of the twins were built. Corvair faced much more better with the piston line, which entered service in considerable numbers around the world. It flew its first C-240 on March 1947 and went on to build more than 1,000 aircraft of this series of improved variants, some of them turboprop conversions. With the DC-6 and the DC-7, Constellation, Strata Cruiser, and the Corvair lines in widespread service in the U.S., Europe airlines. America's dominance of the airline market had been established. And that's where we are today. So next time we'll be in European struggles, UK and France, 1945 to 1955. That's where we'll start next time. So, thanks for reading with me. If you like what I'm reading, push like and subscribe. Help me out grow this channel so I can keep reading to you guys. So, thank you and have a good one.